everyone. Thank you, everyone who is starting to join us for our second event during our 2024 Halloween Bash. Today, we're here for our expert panel discussion themed Ancient Undead with quite a few great panelists who I'll let introduce yourselves. We got people from all different areas of study. We're so excited to talk about this today. So quickly, what is SASA? SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. We work to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work towards our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. We do this in many ways. SASA has a ton of great projects and a ton of great resources for ancient studies research. So please do go check us out. We have a searchable database of ancient studies resources. We do a lot of live streaming and archeo gaming, special packages for teachers and things like that, and literally everything's free. So please check us out. And if you like what you see from us, please follow and subscribe basically everywhere. You can search Save Ancient Studies Alliance. It really makes a difference following and subscribing to our pages and engaging with our content. We live stream to YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook, sometimes also Twitter and Instagram. The recordings are saved there, and we post on social media literally every day. Some protocol for the event. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. We really want to hear from you guys in the chat. We are here to discuss the things that you guys want to learn about and talk about. So please say hi to us in the chat and ask your questions or give us your thoughts on what we're discussing. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. And the live events, again, are recorded. I'm sorry, I didn't have the whole list, but they're recorded on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, all of the platforms that they stream on. And last but not least, this is part of one of our major fundraisers of the year. The goal of the fundraiser this year is to get more monthly recurring donors. So you can do this for as little as $5 a month through PayPal on our website, or also you can subscribe on Twitch for $5 a month. And you can get different tiered perks like discounts on our bazaar and stuff like that. I actually have a mug from our bazaar. Ooh, if you can see it with my cool background. This is one of our older ones when we had our old name. So it's a relic of the past of SASA. Okay, and with that, thank you very much all for joining us. And I'm going to start to hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So just because she's next to me, I'm going to call our Martina first.
Yes, all right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see many people online to join us. I'm looking forward to an interesting panel discussion. So my name is Martina. I'm a postdoc in classics at the University of Johannesburg. So I am in South Africa, where it's currently summer. As you can see from what I'm wearing, it is quite warm at the moment. But I come from the Netherlands, and I know in Europe and the US, it's getting winter. It's actually a bit warm here for me at the moment, but I'm sure it will be all right. I mainly work on Greek and Roman stuff, but I also know quite a bit about the other civilizations surrounding it, like Egypt and Mesopotamia. So this will be an interesting discussion.
Great. Thank you, Martina. Howard is next on my screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor of Archaeology at the University of Chester, and I specialise in early medieval archaeology and a bit of history and literature and other stuff too. And I'm really interested to hear what everyone's take on the ancient undead is, because they haunt my dreams as well as haunt my social media platforms with various information and misinformation that we come across about the dead and the undead online. So it's all going to be fun.
Yeah, please. That's a great point too. If you have any questions about things that you've heard about that seem kind of misinformation-y, we love to address that kind of stuff. So please send that kind of stuff in the chat. Also, just a shout out, Howard's pages are called Archaeodeath. Follow him as well for great content. Next on my screen is Irina.
Hello, very happy to be here to discuss this fascinating topic. I am Irina. I'm a historian and history teacher. My main area of interest is the Viking Age, but also old Icelandic sagas. I rather tend to go into this direction of cultural history. And I also have a YouTube channel, which is called Shield of Skuld, where I talk a lot about such topics. And I also teach with the Signum University, otherwise known as the Tolkien University.
That's amazing. Irina also comes on for live stream masterclasses with Sasa basically every month. So follow us to check that out. And last but not least, Brian.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm really honored to join this esteemed panel. I'm Brian Smith. I have 2 master's degrees in Egyptology. I currently am an independent researcher, and I have actually worked with the Archaeogaming projects with Sasa before through Paige Brevik as a consultant to make sure that the quality and the accuracy of ancient Egyptian themes within the video gaming archaeogaming platforms are as accurate as they possibly can be, because I tend to be that guy. Things got to be right.
Yes. So just to shout out that really quick too, our Archaeogaming education modules is one of the things I mentioned that's specifically made for teachers. They're really great, funded through a few different projects, including the New Jersey Council for Humanities. And they're basically free downloads that teachers can use to teach about ancient studies in their classrooms that have videos that go along with them, using video games to teach about ancient history, to try to make it more fun for younger learners. And it has everything you need with a lesson plan and stuff like that. So check that out on our website as well. Okay, so with that and all of these plugs and stuff, thank you guys so much. My first question, just to kick off the panel discussion, to kind of give everyone the context of where each of our lovely experts are coming from when we're talking about ancient undead. Just to give a little background, we actually, our first thought for what this topic would be was a little bit more zombie themed. And we were like, but zombies are modern. So what's a way that we can talk about undead stuff in the ancient world? And we ended up just calling it ancient undead, because every culture has different ways of looking at what the afterlife means or undead means and stuff like that. So again, I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you, since now we know kind of your areas of study. I know it's like hard to define, because you could probably say 10 million things about what ancient undead could mean in your culture. But if you can give a little brief description of what you think ancient undead means coming from your background of area of study, that would be awesome. I think we can kind of just go in the same order, just because that's how you guys are on my screen. So Martina, if you want to go first.
Yes, of course. When thinking of ancient undead, looking at Greek and Roman societies especially, the Greeks and Romans, they believed in the underworld. Anyone who passed away, they didn't really pass away like physically, literally, not really like we see it nowadays. It's more like they believed you went to the underworld, or Hades, as Hades is what they called it. And Hades came around as some sort of spirits that were not really sort of more, they were more like cursed. But what happened quite often in many stories is that we see heroes, like Greek heroes, especially some Roman heroes as well, going to the underworld to see ancient deceased relatives, for example, to talk to them, to ask for advice. So in that way, we see that the underworld to the Greeks and Romans, it was sort of part of their life in a way. It was possible, at least in stories, for heroes to descend into Hades, to talk to their deceased relatives, asking for advice and for help, and then going back to the world of the living and continue their daily tasks in a way. So I believe that way shows that they were sort of still there. You could go see them, not really physically, because it is stories, all of that, of course. It is how the Greeks and Romans saw their family members. They were still somewhere around. In Roman households also, you had a place for the deceased ancestors. You had to honor them. You had to make sure they were happy and satisfied. And there you could also go for advice. So they were really a part of everyday culture in that way.
Mm-hmm. I love that you brought that up too, because I wonder if it can be thought of in a way as undead, of these heroes that are going in and out of the underworld. This is like totally random, but I was watching Game of Thrones and Jon Snow dies and comes back and they're like, you were dead. Like, they're like freaking out about it, obviously. And it's like, so are you a real person now? Are you the same person? Like, what's even going on with this? Are you undead because you went to the underworld and came back? So that's like another cool point on it too. That was great. Thank you, Martina. Howard.
Yes, this is a really fascinating topic because my area is very much a little bit overlapping with Irina, so I don't want to tread too much on what she's going to say about the Viking world. But I'm really interested in this comparative approach to looking at the early Middle Ages and then trickling through into the later Middle Ages and the early modern period about different European traditions of the undead. And I suppose my default, if I was introducing this to someone new to the idea of the undead, is to make the point that in comparative anthropological terms, all of the dead are undead. And it's when our categorization is often about, how long do they remain undead? How long do they become are they actively in dialogue with the living? And I think many different cultures around the world have different senses of moments or key stages in the funeral and after the funeral and anniversaries, which is what kind of Halloween may, at least in part, be about, where the dead are close. But then there are other moments where the dead are moving away, or in some cases, the aim is to expunge them completely. And so I suppose it's not about whether the dead are dead or undead. It's about all manner of different registers and spectrums of being part of the living world in biological death. So that's totally wishy-washy, but I think it's important to sort of point to start off with. So the things I'm interested in for my early medieval focus and what happens next is really how the archaeological evidence can sort of flesh out, so to speak, different responses to the dead, and how perhaps at different times in different places we see different ways in which practices are responding to people who don't die as they should do or aren't undead as they should do. Is the unexpected, what we often call the deviant burials, and the treatments that are afforded to those that sit outside of the normal range. And that's a problematic term in itself, but it's about trying to work out, were these people who are socially or spiritually dislocating or disrupting, and were the procedures we see in the archaeological record and we find in some of the written sources, showing us, emergency measures of when someone just won't die like they should and they come back. And a lot of the early medieval undead that links into we have no best from the Icelandic tradition, but a lot of the accounts we get also from early medieval England are physical revenants. They are the physical corpse is coming out of the grave in some way and coming back to the homes of the living and causing sickness and further death. So and then what do you do about that? And I think the archaeological record does seem to show some variety of different perspectives from the 5th, 6th century right the way up to the 17th, 18th century. After the Middle Ages, these Catholic periodizations are not that useful, where people are responding in a variety of different specific ways to how do we get the dead to be dead and stop bothering us. And that's where you have the overlap with issues of vampirism and other terms that have their roots in Eastern European traditions, but we can see our earlier versions of that in the historical and archaeological record across medieval Europe. Where am I going with this? I suppose my point is, finally getting to one, is that all the dead are undead, and what we're thinking really about is the dead that don't go the way they should do, the unexpected. And that may be because of the personality of the dead person, or it could be because of the horrible circumstances in which they die, or some other factors outside of the control, the timing of death. And those things can interleave and intersect, meaning that some deaths are more challenging than others. They're causing problems for the community. And we see the evidence of how people then react to that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you brought up like 10 great things to dig into more. I love it. One of the ones just I want to say out loud so that we don't forget is, or what I was kind of thinking as you were saying this is how cultural things are reflected in how they're talking about dealing with this. Because kind of like you said, it's like it's like a new thing. Like this is a new problem. This isn't the norm. This doesn't usually happen. So how are we dealing with this? And how does the cultural context play into how they're dealing with it, or even how they're labeling, like you said, that like labeling terms of a vampire versus a zombie versus whatever. So very interesting. Thank you. Irina, what do you think?
Yeah, this is pretty much in my area of studies, actually. Although I do come from this more literary direction, so I'm just going to say that the Old Norse undead, in my opinion, are to be regarded as a social and literary construct, at least in the 13th and 14th century. These are the texts I deal with. And I have noticed something very interesting. So apart from what Howard was saying about the corporeality, that's also something that's very strange for me, because I could notice how much they resemble actually what we believe today about vampires and zombies. They resemble pretty much these characters because they're very physical, they're very corporeal, they interact with the living in a very destructive way. So essentially they are described through the effects that they have on the community. So they can be used in order to provoke an individual to react, let's say, in a more heroic way, or to force an individual to act as a protector of the community, but they also interact with the community itself. A revenant can have disastrous effects on the community, both socially and economically. And I also find it very interesting to see how many different characters we have in this literature, because we have the violent, the so-called afterganger, the aftergoer, literally speaking. These would be the more violent characters, but then you have the mound dweller as well. And the mound dweller is very interesting because you can find it rather in the legendary sagas, and they are these revenants that don't really leave their mound. And it is the task of the hero to go on a quest and to break into the mound and demonstrate their heroic superiority and so on by fighting with these revenants. Also, one interesting point I would like to make is the difficulty of categorization. So yeah, we can talk about Aftergangar or Haugbuar, like these mound dwellers and so on. Later on, given the Christian influence, also about ghosts, so rather these ethereal appearances and so on. But there isn't really a very clear-cut way of defining them. And I know that on many internet sites you can find the term draugr to define these creatures, but this term is actually very rarely used. You can find it in skaldic poetry, for example, skaldic poetry written in the 9th or 10th century, but with the meaning of a body or a warrior rather. So it's not really the meaning of somebody dead. That's a later interpretation. And the most common term used for the undead is actually that of troll in Old Norse literature. And I find this very relevant to, for this idea that they are these liminal creatures. They are on the boundary between the dead and the living. So they police the boundary between the possible and the impossible. So I find that also very interesting, the way they are presented in this kind of literature.
Yay, I'm so excited for this discussion. You guys are all bringing up great things. Okay, last but not least, Brian, who I have to point out is the Egyptologist. So one of the questions I'm going to ask you right after you give your little explanation is to also say maybe a brief thing, maybe it turns into more about mummies specifically, since that's such a thing that people think of with undead and, of course, Egyptology.
Right. Well, thank you. First of all, I'm really fascinated to hear from my co-panelists, because a lot of what you're saying is also true about Egypt. The concepts of the soul, the fact that there is a word for the dead in ancient Egypt. There are several words for the word death, or even the word to kill or to slaughter. Usually those are only in reference to slaughtering or killing enemies of Egypt, political enemies of Egypt. But when you talk about death, or even use the word death, which in ancient Egyptian, one of the words is mit or mit. Confusingly, they didn't write vowels, so thanks, ancient Egypt. So MT. And it's curious that the word mit is also very possibly closely related to the ancient Phoenician god of death, Mot. So we've got a little bit of linguistic connection there that's really interesting. In one of the literature stories that every Egyptology student of Egyptology has to read, whether in in hieroglyphic form or hieratic form, or whether it's in translation, the story of the shipwrecked sailor. And so I'm not going to go on too long about this, but this sailor, along with his crew, who was very excellent, and they could foretell the storm before it came. Ironically, a storm came, and all the crew members were washed overboard, and they drowned. But specifically, the text actually said that the ship was struck, but the ship died. So there is a finality when using the word to die. Like whenever a king dies or a queen dies or anyone dies, they don't use the word death, or they are very adverse to using the word death. In the pyramid text, I believe it was Pepi II. If you're an Egyptologist out there, please don't at me. But I believe it was Pepi II, where you have these pyramid texts written on the inside of these corridors and chambers of the pyramid itself, and it says basically, remove your earth, meaning, okay, we recognize that you're actually a dead dude, but we're talking to you as if you were alive. Remove your earth, shake off the dust, and rise to join the imperishable stars, those stars around the North Pole that never set. Some references to since they never set, then those are the souls of the gods themselves. So the king is joining this kind of celestial journey to join with the gods. I would say, and finally, before my final point, the ancient undead really has its foundation in the Osirian mythology. The god Osiris, considered to be the first mythological king of ancient Egypt, murdered and slaughtered by his brother, cut up into 14 pieces, reassembled by Osiris's wife and also sister. That gets really complicated, and creates the first mummy. And so she, therefore, by her magic, revives her dead husband, who exists kind of in a liminal space called the duat, which is kind of the goal or the destination for every dead person's spirit, to go to the duat and be rejuvenated, be resurrected, be reborn, just like Osiris was. And even in reference to Osiris, the best story that we have is from Plutarch, who's not an Egyptian, but he heard stories from, supposedly, heard stories from ancient Egyptian priests, and so gave us, in his Isis and Osiris, De Iside and Osiride, I believe is the Latin, the best account, the best narrative of this entire cycle. That really is kind of the foundation of what the ancient Egyptians considered to be the ancient undead. It all started with a god who is not here in the living realm, but is the king of the afterlife and ultimately the judge of morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the major foundational myths of all Egyptian religion. So that's an interesting part of it too, of the this basis of how their context is for the world. And again, in Egypt in particular, I think that's something that people, obviously modern people or whatever, or throughout history when Egypt was ancient to them, misunderstand about Egypt. And that's where all of these modern myths come from about mummies and stuff, because they really don't understand the context of how Egyptians were thinking about this in their day-to-day lives. Also, one of the things that you slightly mentioned, but this is where my head went with it, is how Egyptians also, and Brian will be able to explain this so much better, kind of to them, some objects and hieroglyphs and stuff like that were a real embodiment of the thing. So the way they talk about things, like with you saying the ship was dead, and normally they wouldn't talk about it saying, oh, this queen is dead, because that's like there's like too much finality to that or whatever.
Right.
So like often on their temples and stuff, they'll write things in different hieroglyphs than it actually is, because they don't want to use this one hieroglyph inside the temple, because that would be wrong to use it, because it's like bringing that thing to life in this temple where it shouldn't be. So even that is this very interesting way of thinking about things that could be undead then, because literally if you're writing something down that's something dead, is it undead then? Almost like Howard said, everything that's dead is undead though. So is there more of a distinction between it when you're writing it down, or is it just things that are dead are undead, so that's just how you write it? Again, Brian can explain that so much more. People who have a little bit of context of Egyptology will maybe understand my brief explanation of that better.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as the Egyptian mindset, when you write something down, it's meant to last. And especially within the context, and again, I'll go back to the pyramid text, 2600 BCE or so. So, approximately 4,600 years ago, depending on, the 5th and 6th dynasty chronology. But there are hieroglyphs, which are literally carved in stone, which are meant to last because these are spells that are meant to be read by the dead king to help, to assist him in his own solar resurrection. 5th and 6th dynasty, that's the first time we really start seeing Osiris mentioned, who later on is this kind of, salvation figure, being the judge of the dead and stuff like that. In the Old Kingdom, it was the king's resurrection was primarily solar based. So it was focused on the rising and the setting of the sun god, the god Ra or Atum Ra, or various other permutations. But some of these hieroglyphs, which are written on the inside of a tomb, ostensibly, to be sealed and covered over, nobody ever is going to enter into the tomb again. They are solely for the purpose of the dead king. And there are hieroglyphs, and one of my favorites are figures of snakes that do actually have a phonetic function within the Egyptian language. So one of them is the horned viper, which is a snake that you can see today in Egypt. It is extremely venomous. I mean, like once one bites you, it's basically over. But it has the phonetic sound value of the letter F, and that sounds a lot like kind of the hissing of a snake, right? So you'll have these depictions, within the grammatical context of the inscriptions. You'll have that viper, but because that viper is so very dangerous, they will actually intentionally cut the viper in half, or have knives stuck in its back, so it still retains its grammatical function, but the snake is actually rendered harmless.
Right.
So-
Yeah,
so-
that part of Egyptian literature, I guess, I don't know what the right word to call it, it is so fascinating to me, and it's so much more intricate. Brian can come on to do a whole talk just about that, I'm very sure.
I've had enough
how
coffee,
these
so if I do start to
representations-
ramble, I apologize.
No, you're good. But how these interpretations of stuff that, obviously human language is totally a human construct that we have a shared understanding of in different areas and cultures and whatever, that they have this understanding of it in that way. Like, we know this is a super deadly snake, and that's why we wouldn't want to have it on here. So are there any things like that in any of our other friends' cultures of either the power of spell/writing things down that make it more real in a way, is kind of where I would go with this. And maybe the contrast between how Egyptians literally, like, physically are like, if I draw this snake is going to come bite someone, versus writing something down that's maybe against the snake. If I talk about this snake, then the snake won't come to my house because I'm saying for them to leave me alone in this spell or whatever it is. So yes, any thoughts on this? Yeah, Irina.
Yeah, I think there are some good candidates of runic stones that we might regard as potential grave magic. For example, we have a couple of rune stones with the message, make good use of this grave, Njot Kummels. And all right, that can be interpreted as some kind of rest in peace in a heathen way. But besides that, I think it might also indicate something else going on here, like make good use of this grave in the sense don't come back walking around and mixing with the world of the living. There is one stone, for example, the mold stone from Denmark, which has a message saying something like, okay, Colvin fixes joyful and eternal runes. And there is a series of runes which are rather difficult to decipher, but one of the ways to decipher them would be the expression denial of walking, or in translation, it would be something like denial of walking. And if this interpretation is correct, then I think that would be a good example of grave magic meant to like bind you to the grave once you're dead. And there's also an interesting runestone, the Gödlev runestone, where you have something like Thistil, Mistil, Kistil, which is very well known magic formula in both the Viking world, and you can also find it on runic sticks in medieval Bergen. Apparently it was very, very popular. And this can be, again, interpreted as something like leechcraft or magic, binding magic, like with this kind of formula, mistletoe and casket, something like that. And then you can also use the futhark, so the alphabet, in order to make the spell more powerful, because we also have a lot of examples of just futhark rows randomly carved on runestones that are very difficult to interpret without this idea of some kind of magic being involved here. So I may be a little off, but I think that's a good indication.
No,
that
yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Especially the first one you said. It's interesting because it's kind of like it's like in a context of talking directly to the dead person. Like you make use of this grave, like they can still understand it, they can still communicate that in a way. Like you compared it to rest in peace, but that's a little more of like a well wish for the person, right? It's not really like talking directly to them, you rest in peace right here. So even that, though, the way that it's phrased, it means something to them, right? Like, again, people who are in this culture and doing these kinds of things every day, like have a context of that means like that they're talking directly to this person, right? Very interesting. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this kind of like writing things down that make the undead real? Which of course, a lot of what we know about this kind of stuff is from like literary sources that we have found and whatever. But yeah, Martina, what were you going to say?
The connection is a bit shaky. I hope it will. But the connection seems a bit shaky this side. I hope it. It makes me think.
Yeah, I can hear you. It's just a little bit of a lag. Okay. Oh, and now I can't hear her anymore. Uh-oh, Martina, now I can't hear you anymore. I'm sorry. I maybe mute and unmute. Yes, Martina's microphone totally went out for me. Can anyone else hear Martina?
No.
No. Oh, Martina, I'm sorry. If you want to, Martina, you can write something in the chat and I can read it out loud for you. I'm sorry. It's like coming in a little bit, but very randomly.
So if I may, talking about letters to the dead, I mean, the whole trope, for the past 200 plus years of people, especially Europeans, Americans, anybody who goes to Egypt, they're focused and, fixated on, the ancient Egyptians' fascination with death, and, oh, they're so, morose and so morbid. That's absolutely the total opposite. The Egyptians celebrated life. They wanted life to continue. The reason why we have so much material death culture is because if you look at the thin stream of the Nile Valley from like a satellite image, it's surrounded by desert. And so as an agricultural society, you're not going to bury the dead within fertile, tillable soil. You're going to stick them out in the desert. And our earliest our earliest mummies are actually naturally mummified because of the salts that occur and the desiccating dry heat of the sand. And so at some point, the earliest, I would prefer at this point to call them Nilotic peoples, because this is also observed in ancient Nubia as well. These inhabitants of the Nile corridor are seeing the bodies of their deceased, unfortunately sometimes dug up by by desert dogs, origin of Anubis, right? He's the embalmer of the dead, and he is shown as a canine. And so the Egyptians, or the peoples of the Nile, looked at this dog, and this is complete speculation on my part, and maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit too much. The peoples of the Nile saw the dogs wandering around in the cemeteries, digging around for gruesomely fresh corpses. They apparently translated this into, Anubis is like Hermes, right? Kind of a messenger figure between the upper and lower realms, and escorting the deceased into the afterlife. When, to be honest, the dog was just looking for fresh meat. But getting back to letters, there's a site in Upper Egypt called Deir el-Medina. It's a very well-known site, very well documented. Hundreds of thousands of fragments of pottery shards, scraps of papyrus, inscriptions written on the inside of a bowl. One of my favorites comes from, I think it's the 19th dynasty, where a woman is writing a letter on an ostraca on a broken bed of limestone flake. Or maybe, actually, I think it is papyrus. I'm sorry. So she's writing a letter to her husband complaining about their son. Thing is, the husband's dead. So she's writing letters complaining that your son, this son of yours, right? She's not the biological mother. She's actually blaming the dead guy for the poor behavior, the lazy behavior of his son. So she's expecting some sort of interaction, right? She's expecting for somehow the deceased to, cross over, influence the son's behavior, or, do something effective. One of the words in ancient Egypt for a deceased person, and again, I'm probably rambling, and I hope I'm not. One of the words for a deceased person is the ach, which means glorified spirit or effective spirit. So that means they actually have some sort of capability to, physically interact in this realm, whether it's through dreams or what have you. But they can also be ticked off. You can offend the dead, and I think that's kind of where we get this modern day curse of the pharaohs trope. There are actually inscriptions. Speaking of writing, there are actually inscriptions that basically threaten all sorts of harm to come to anyone who violates a tomb, or even threatening the family of anyone who violates a tomb, including, and I hope this isn't a trigger point, including sexual assault. If you defile my tomb, then this is going to happen to your wife. And I'm not going to get more graphic than that, because they literally spell it out quite graphically what is expected to happen for those who defile a tomb.
Right. And tomb stuff is very interesting. This whole myth of the curses of the tombs. But again, if you understand even pretty surface level about what Egyptians thought about death and why it was so important that you didn't disturb the body and the tomb, like, of course, you're going to write things on it that try to deter. It's like having a beware of dog sign outside your house because you're trying to deter people from robbing your house or kidnapping your children or whatever, right? Like, so again, it's something that people see and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so extreme. And like, what if they actually have the magic to do this and whatever? But if you believed that your whole life was actually your afterlife and that was the important part of your existence, of course, you're going to say something to try to get people to not ruin it. Like, right? So yay learning. Okay, I just want to bring up one thing from the chat that is kind of veering in a different direction, but we can always get back to written down stuff. But I just have to say it because we did very briefly mention vampires. What do we think about vampires, or from your cultural context? Howard, I think you mentioned something very briefly about it could be an idea of where actually you and Irina both of, this could be the roots of where people went and ran with the idea of vampires.
Okay.
From?
I mean, there's different ways I can answer that question, but of course, I recognise it as a modern popular culture phenomenon. I obviously I believe in vampires in that sense. They're everywhere. The same way I believe in Santa Claus and anything else that's a manifest material part of our popular culture. In all seriousness, no, and this is a point I might raise here. And it affects the way we talk about these issues, is that the concept of vampires, and when we talk about vampire burials, when we're talking about burials that showed acts or anti-vampire burials, we've got to be aware that this is often sensationalized popular archaeology, and it's a term and a label that brings with it a host of baggages, including very derogatory attitudes towards Central and Southeastern European peoples. It's this idea of they're so superstitious, they believe in these things. It's it has a whole nested levels of Western media, stereotyping parts of Europe. And we have to be very wary of that when we're talking about those burials. So yes, when we're talking about 19th, 20th century folklore traditions, we can talk about vampires. When we're going back earlier, we have to think there are maybe many different conceptualized forms of demonic possession, demonic and satanic illusion that people were imagining or affecting graves, as well as the agency of the good dead who are powerful and are trying to communicate with the living to make them do the right thing that they failed to do. So there's a whole, we've got to be careful. It's not only simply a gloss, it is actually quite a pernicious gloss in terms of portrayals. And the same with zombies, because you see archaeologists doing a sensationalist use of zombies. I mean, ideas of zombies are very much rooted in white supremacy, in the colonial era, in derogatory attitudes towards African spiritualism. So we've got, I just want to flag up those pop culture problems that are sit behind and around all of these conversations.
Perfect. Irina, do you have thoughts? I feel
Yeah,
like you must.
I have a lot of thoughts here because I'm from Eastern Europe. So, but first I'm going to begin with the Old Norse thing. I just wanted to say that we have some kind of references to vampirism as well in Old Norse literature, but not transmission by biting or the bloody thing, but with reference to contagion. Like you can have a mass contagion stemming from some kind of unnamed creature, something that you're going to find, for example, in the saga of Grettir the Strong. There you have a shepherd by the name of Glomar, and he becomes sick, and he turns himself into an Aptergang, into a revenant, following the attack of an unnamed creature. It's generally termed as an evil creature. We have no idea what this was. But then again, this contamination spreads in all the household, and this is not the only case. So I think it is a way of commenting on things like death and contagion and disease, generally speaking, like this use of the vampire as figure. So that was the point I wanted to make about Old Norse literature, that you do have this connection between vampirism and disease. And then I wanted to say, also because I have a rather personal interest in this, I was asked myself plenty of times if I believe in vampires, because I'm from Romania, and I want to say that this is actually very modern construction. Like the way we imagine vampires nowadays as these high-class, charming characters, and also this obsession with blood and gore and so on. This is actually a modern construction, and it stems pretty much from a circle of literary personalities such as Lord Byron, and then Shelley and Sheridan Le Fanu, for example, with the work Carmilla, and then you have Polidori with I think it was the first work, The Vampire, where he actually describes the vampire as we see it nowadays, as a member of high-class society, being capable of, mingling with the rest of society, going unnoticed, and then committing all these reproachable acts, from sexual assault to death, and so on. So I think it's very much influenced by the Gothic literature that was specific to Victorian times. So we're dealing here with the modern aspect of it in the 18th and 19th century. And speaking of sensationalism, I think it was pretty much sensationalized in Western press. For example, what happened in 1732, I think it was, in Poland, where there were those reports about vampiric sightings, and then everyone started to like put a sickle on the neck of the dead person in order to prevent people from returning from the dead, and so on. So there is really a mix of elements that I think combined in order to create this very modern image of the vampire we have nowadays. I think it's a very, very interesting topic because of the film Nosferatu, which is showing up in December now. So I think that's why.
Another one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Right.
I don't think it's a remake; it's a reinterpretation.
Yeah.
Well, and then
I'm
of course
excited.
we've got the introduction of, or perhaps even the reintroduction into Western society of Anne Rice, the works of Anne Rice.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
Interview with a Vampire.
Yep. Exactly.
And of course, with due respect, the late Anne Rice. There is still a little bit of Egyptian belief in my head. You know, you don't speak ill of the dead, no matter how cheesy some of the works might be. One of her books that I read when I was an undergrad was called The Mummy, and it was based on, and this was decades ago. The premise was that Ramses II, Ramses the Great, of ancient Egyptian fame, while he was at the Battle of Kadesh in the Levant, he encountered a priest, I believe, and either forced or convinced him to give himself this elixir of eternal life, and so so it completely changed him physically. He, of course, Anne Rice style. He becomes this beautiful, gorgeous hunk with long, flowing hair. And then I forget the context necessarily, but he was, I believe, he was vilified and wrapped alive. So as long as he was out of the sun and in the tomb, he was the ancient undead. But then, and this is where it gets really fun. In the book, and I hope this isn't spoiling it for anybody who really wants to read the book. Then the famous Cleopatra VII in Alexandria, a Macedonian Greek woman, finds the mummy, finds the elixir, swallows it herself, and then for the rest of the novel, it's this romance between Ramses the Great and the great Cleopatra. And it was so just over the top, but also perfect, and perfectly in line with what Anne Rice was known to have written.
So okay, something that both of you just brought up is kind of like sexualizing these characters or figures. Is that something that, and honestly also to get like a little bit more general, you can kind of just talk about like gods and myth in general, but like sexualizing these kinds of figures in ancient history, is that because that's definitely an aspect of it now. Especially with vampires. Like zombies maybe a little bit less, but even that, just like undead things, someone's loved one coming back to life and they're still in love with them, or vampires are like always hot now. there's like
right. And I think the modern narrative is that, or at least this is my interpretation, I don't necessarily follow it that closely, but my interpretation is that all vampires are bisexual. That's
in a lot of vampire lore, I guess. I don't know the right way to say it, but I have seen that a lot. Yeah. Howard?
Yeah, from our immediately post-Norman conquest sources about revenants, one of the categories of people that do seem to come back to life are people who are perceived or accused of being particularly lustful or sinning, and there's this whole Christian idea of the sinner. In other cases, it's not so. It's often a very pious person. So it's not. There's no single rule a play here. But you are looking at an overlap between the people that are executed and denied consecrated ground and are buried on the boundaries. We have this archaeological evidence from the 7th, 8th century through to the 12th century of execution cemeteries where people are literally killed. They're hanged, they're decapitated, they're buried. And some of those are obviously criminals. Others may be there for other forms of social deviance, and that therefore there's an overlap between that and people who end up as a emergency because they're coming back to life are taken to those locations. And sometimes it's because they're of even in as ghosts, as revenants, they are overtly violent, they're overtly sexual. I know that overlaps with what Irina can tell us about the literary tradition from the sagas, where there's the draugr, or whatever the term is, tries to get back into bed with their partner of life. But you don't get too much from the sources. But of course, the most famous one is from the Stappen Hill from Derbyshire, which is just about 1100, where there's basically two peasants had died, and they're going around the village spreading sickness and death as revenants will. And so the reaction is you go to the villagers go to their grave, dig them up. They find material evidence to prove that they're guilty because, of course, they got blood all over their shrouds. There's evidence of that they've been moving around, so it must be true. In other words, the idea that the decomposition processes, the disturbance of the graves, is providing the evidence that inspires the story, and then so their reaction is obviously you then cut off their head, put the head between their legs, which is a theme we get across Northern Europe of putting the head between the buttocks or between the legs to confuse the spirit. This it's both insulting the dead, but also just moving the dead around, distracting them from their normal positioning. And then they cut out the hearts of these two peasants. And of course, what you then do is naturally, I say in jest, of course, that you take those hearts, you cremate them at the boundary of the parishes on a high hill. So, and which is the kind of place where we know these execution cemeteries are. So you're taking, if people aren't resting quietly, you treat them like the criminal dead. You prosecute them after death, and then you punish them, and then take their remains. And as they're cremating the hearts on the hillside, they saw a black crow fly up from the flames. So there's this kind of symbol sign that there was something amiss. Not necessarily it was the personality of the dead, or their sexuality, or their violence in life, but it's something that had taken them over that was particularly violent. And I've gone off track from the sexual aspect, but
no, that's okay.
More, but it's more just the idea of the sinner. And the sinner could be a moral. It's linked into a moral structure of the society at the time, of the church, of consecrated ground, versus those that have contravened in life or in death as revenants. So there's always a sexual dimension to it, one way or another, but it's not always obvious what it is.
Right.
I'll shut up.
Right. No, you're good. Brian thought of something as you were talking, though.
Which actually, that's a wonderful account, Howard. Thank you very much, because the same thing did happen in ancient Egypt as well. The very famous Narmer palette, which is in the British Museum, on the verso, shows the king marching, on a field, and there are 10 decapitated enemies. And the heads are placed between the legs or close to the groin. There also are no genitalia on these enemies. And we do know from much later texts where the Egyptians, whenever they would capture the enemy, in battle, oftentimes would cut off the right hand to take tally. And we even have inscriptions with, a seated scribe writing on a writing board, counting how many hands, and there are piles and piles of hands in these images. And then later on, they decide, well, a person has two hands, so let's just instead emasculate the enemy and start lopping off their penises. And so we have accounts where, I don't necessarily know if this is sexual or not, but it certainly is emasculating the dead.
Right. And it's interesting how it could play into being obviously sexual, especially again in Egypt, like these things represent something. One of the questions that came into my head when Howard was talking was like, are there any stories about a risk of someone coming back to life to like impregnate someone? Because then that's another way of like, then what is this baby? Is this baby actually alive? What is this going to do? What does this mean for this culture? But also I know Irina wanted to say something too.
Yeah, I just want to add that there are a couple of interesting examples in the sagas, but it's not actually men; it's women. For example, in the saga of Eric the Red, we have the character Sigridur, who apparently died following a contamination. There is a story that is common with the story of the Greenlanders, the saga of the Greenlanders. There was this contamination that apparently affected only the heathen population, not the Christian one. So again, the connection with religion is a pretty strong one. And Sigrid does not really behave in a very violent manner. She essentially only comes back to life in order to sleep with her husband. But her husband Thorstein is so terrified by her that he essentially places an axe in her chest, and that's how he deals with it. And there's also this connection between sexuality and old age in the sagas, which again seems to be something people are terrified of. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. The character of Thorgunna from the saga of the people of Eyri, she is described as this middle-aged woman, very tall and very strong and so on. And she is also described as someone having perhaps too great of a fancy towards the farm boy who is, I think, 14 or 15. And he's described as being this very masculine guy, so something you would not use to describe a teenager, generally speaking. But in the saga, you do have this idea of something inappropriate going on, and Thorgunna also comes back from the dead, and this boy actually is the only one capable of sending both her and the other revenants who come back to the afterlife, to send them back where they belong. So I think there's also an interesting connection there.
Brian, what were you going to say?
Irina, that's fascinating because there's so many parallels in what everyone is offering.
Yeah.
So I talked about Osiris being chopped up in 14 pieces. The 14th piece was his penis, and it got thrown into the River Nile by his brother after his brother had killed him. And so the penis was swallowed by a fish. And in many ancient temples, there were levels of priesthood who would not eat fish because it was considered to be, polluted. So Isis, who gathered along with Anubis, right, our dog friend, comes along, wraps Osiris's body into the first mummy, revives him briefly enough so that Isis can conceive Horus, the god of kingship. So there is sexuality there. Some accounts say that she, by her powerful magic, did this without the benefit of his member. And some say that she actually fashioned one through her powerful magic and then mated with Osiris. So I don't mean to extrapolate this too far, but, kind of a virgin birth, if you will. I mean, there is sex and sexuality, but there is no biological founding of the conception of Horus. It's based in magic, which is very, very interesting. So I hope I didn't go too far on that.
No. Martina and Howard both had something to say too. Whoever wants to. Martina, let's see if your microphone is working again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. All right. I hope it's okay now. Thank you. Brian, that's an interesting story. Continuing on that, there is a story of Zeus, the supreme god, who at some point defeats his father Kronos. Kronos was one of the titans of the earlier generations of gods, and then Zeus, with some of his brothers and sisters, they defeat Kronos, basically, and then they take over and become the Olympian gods. When Zeus defeats his father, he cuts off his penis, throws it into the sea. Poseidon, the god of the seas, finds it there, and somehow then, from the foam of the sea that appears there, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, shows up and appears, and in that way Aphrodite is born. So in that way, sort of love and peace are brought into the world after this. One was Etid, who was like a rather mean god. Who was like a rather mean, vicious character of a god, and then literally his genitals are cut off, just thrown away into the sea, and then something sort of magical happens. They didn't really give any much detail in the story, but something sort of magical happens, and then Aphrodite, the goddess of love, appears there.
Mm-hmm.
On a seashell.
Right, and that's very interesting too, because it's like immaculate conception without even a woman or anything, but then it makes a woman who is the most womanly woman of Greek mythology. Howard, what were you going to say?
I just came across another late medieval example that does have a sexual element. This is recorded in an article by Professor John Blair, where he talks about a medieval ghost story of a Yorkshire rector who had been buried in the chapter house at Byland Abbey, one of the big Cistercian houses of Yorkshire. And he'd wandered around at night to gouge out his former concubine's eyes, and they had to take him back and dump him in a lake as the only way of getting rid of his corpse, to stop him from doing further ill deeds. So the idea is of sexual, his morality is the one in question, but he doesn't go back to do anything sexual, but to actually violently attack the woman whom he had been having relations with. So it's all rather there's various different ways, isn't there? And there's lots of other examples where it's not really clear why those individuals are, and in other cases it's a totally positive thing. I can tell you about Alfred the Great. You heard of Alfred the Great? He was a revenant, apparently, according to William of Malmesbury, I think it was the accounts. It says he's very skeptical, but he says, and this is nothing sexual, of course, he says, they say that King Alfred was buried first in Winchester Cathedral because his own monastery was still unfinished, but that not long after, the deluded canons maintained that the king's ghost returned to his dead body and wandered at night through their lodgings, and so his son and successor took up on his father's his father's remains and laid them in peace in the new monastery. So in this sense, he says this nonsense and the like, wins credit among the English. They were known for their inborn credulity. So this idea that obviously the writer doesn't believe this, but it's another way in which the dead walk is because they haven't got to their final resting place. So at least the story is about that Alfred the Great is buried, but he's not resting happily because he just wants to be buried in his new monastery. It hasn't been completed. So how that story was generated as we have to finish the monastery or Alfred won't be in his right place. This is nothing about the moral character of the revenant or a demonic possession in that sense, but it's actually a very powerful, good worthy person whose spirit is driving the living to complete the accurate and appropriate obsequies and create the burial repository that he should be buried in. So that's a really different take. So I suppose for me, this is what I get back to my original point. There's probably a whole series of overlapping ideas at play here in the medieval Christian world, with folk traditions and pre-Christian traditions, still hanging around. Fear of the demonic possession, fear of Satan creating illusions, fear of and the personality of the dead person being powerful or exceptional. So I think there's probably a mess of ideas that we perhaps oversimplify at our peril.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a little bit different, but Martina's stuff made me think about it a bit, and different things you were saying. One of the ones that I was thinking about as you were talking about this is Persephone and Hades. So Persephone going in and out of the underworld. And then I know that, of course, in Egyptian mythology, literally every day they're going in and out of the underworld. So what is this question? Is Persephone dead and she's undead every time that she's coming back to our plane of existence, and then she's dead when she's in Hades, but she's alive here? Same thing with Egyptian stuff. I'm sure there's probably similar stuff in medieval and Norse things too. But yeah, that was just my next point. I kind of wanted to, I don't know if either you want to explain those stories a little bit or slash, just kind of dive into, again, as we were talking about earlier with heroes going into the underworld to go like talk to someone that they need to talk to or find something that they need to find and then coming back out of the underworld. Is that a version of being undead, or is that just like access to undead spaces as a living human? Any thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's an
I'll take it.
interesting question.
Oh, go ahead, Martine. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, after you, it's all right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Much like, and I find this comparison, probably stretching it a bit, and I certainly don't want to, offend you or any of, our audience. But like the way that or at least how I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, every Easter, everyone celebrates Christ is risen. Like it's, well, wasn't he always there the other 364 days of the year? So they're celebrating that. The same thing happens to Osiris. Whenever the Nile starts to flood, there are celebrations of, Osiris's resurrection, because with his death, that brings life to the fertile valley. His body is considered to be his efflux, his bodily fluids are considered to be embodied in the Nile. His physical body is considered to be the fertile black soil around the Nile. So we're talking about very visual. The Egyptians are absolutely focused and very well aware and very keen on the mythology and the biome, the flora and the fauna, the movement of the sun and the stars and the moon, and incorporating those into oftentimes very beautiful and poetic religious imagery and liturgies. So I find it interesting that the ancient undead, the first ancient undead that we have in ancient Egypt, is still or was still conceived of as being alive or present,
Right.
at least in some form.
Right. And like bringing life. And that's something in both of these stories is it plays into all of this stuff of literally how we farm, how we harvest things, whatever, which is from dead things. If there's not dead vegetation dying on the ground, new things aren't growing out of it. Right. Like in all places on the earth. I watch a lot of underwater documentaries and same thing there. So and it's, obviously that's like the story and Martina, I'll let you explain a little bit more of Persephone completely is about that, right? And also there's someone in the chat who asked where Persephone lives, but I am not going to pronounce this correctly. Elysium. Someone asked, doesn't Persephone live in Elysium? So Martine, if you can answer this part.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the question. So Persephone, she is in Greek mythology the daughter of Demeter, who is a goddess of agriculture. And in that way, following her mother, Persephone is also, in a way, a goddess of agriculture related to seasons. To explain a bit more about the story, it says that one day, Persephone was out and about, playing with her friends, just being, just being fun, being outside, having fun being outside. And then suddenly Hades, the god of the underworld, appears with his chariots. It's like the ground breaks open. Hades appears in his chariot with fire-breathing horses. And he kidnaps Persephone and they descend back into the underworld. Then Demeter, her mother, gets very sad because she can't find her daughter. She doesn't know what is going on. And she sort of neglects all her technology and agriculture. So basically, she forgets to make it rain, or it gets too hot, the crops dry. So basically, the natural conditions change in a way. If we look at that from a more modern scientific perspective, probably it must have been a very long, very dry period in which nothing could grow, basically, and people were starting to starve, basically, because there was very little food coming in. So then Demeter keeps roaming around the earth looking for her daughter until she finds out that she is kidnapped by Hades and is now in the underworld. Is she really dead? I would say not, because she is a goddess, so she isn't really a figure that I would say is like literally sort of dead or alive in a sense we would see it nowadays. She's a more of godly spiritual figure, someone that is around wherever, whenever, wherever they want to be. And especially with the Olympian gods, they can be anywhere at any point and do whatever they want. That's what we see in all the stories. So then Zeus intervenes and says, okay, Persephone, you can go back to your mother. You can go back to your mother, live with us on Mount Olympus again, and sort of in that way come back to the world of the living. But she had, she could only stay in the world of the living in that way if she had not eaten or drunk anything in Hades yet in the time she was there. But Hades offered her a pomegranate that made her sort of fall in love with him, but still not completely. And that's when Zeus says, all right, 6 months per year, you will be with your mom and with us on Mount Olympus. The other 6 year, you will be with Hades in the underworld. And sorry for that is all I can do. Sometimes there are even boundaries in a way of what gods can do. They can't even do anything and everything they want. And if we look at that again from a more modern scientific perspective, the 6 months that she was above the odds, so with her mother, that's the season when everything grows. So spring and early summer, while later it gets colder. We get autumn and winter when nothing grows. You have to make sure you get into harvest on time. Otherwise, you won't have enough food to get through the winter until you can. So again, at the beginning of the next year, in spring, when it starts warming up again, when you have another chance to grow your crops for that season. So that was in a way how the ancient Greeks explained different seasons. So when Persephone and Demeter are together on Mount Olympus, they're happy and crops grow. But the other 6 months per year that she has to be in the underworld with Hades, they're both very sad because they're missing each other. And that is the period like autumn, winter, when crops can't grow. And then the question, does she live in Elysium? No, because Elysium was a part of the underworld that was for heroes, especially. They believed everyone who passed away went to the underworld, which was a very miserable, dark place. It was cold and dusty and windy. There was no food, no water. So in a way, the spirits of the deceased were really sort of struggling to get by there, because it was really like a very nasty place is what they believed. And then within that rather nasty place, they had Elysium, which was something much more like what we would say heaven, a much more happy place where there was enough food and drink and anything they wanted. But that was only for heroes, like heroical figures that fought, say, in the Trojan War, or they were conquering territories. They had great, interesting lives. They performed great deeds in their lives. So they then went to Elysium, which is sort of part of the underworld. That was sort of created for those few happy, those happy few, literally, the ones that were allowed to go to the nicer part of the underworld, basically. But Persephone, at the time she was in Hades, with Hades living there, she was just sort of in the underworld space. It is portrayed as them sitting on a throne, literally, as the king and queen of the underworld. But they are sort of ruling over all of it. They're not in one specific place.
Yeah, that's what. Okay, so Brian, I'll go to you next, but I do want to bring this up too about stuff of the underworld is probably a good transition because obviously there's lots of things going on with the beliefs about the underworld and these different cultures we're talking about. But what Brian and Martina were both just talking about of this kind of thing with going along with the seasons or going along with the cycle of the sun and the day, it's like literally when we don't have these things in our physical plane, they're like in the underworld. Like we don't have crops growing right now. They're dead. They're in the underworld, like other things that die. And the sun's not here right now. It's obviously going through the underworld because that's where things go when they're not in our existence directly to us. So I thought that was really interesting. But Brian, you had something else that you were going to say?
Oh, I was just going to briefly ask Martine. So Elysium is then just for the valorous and the heroic. So that sort of blessed realm of the dead has nothing to do with morality.
Yes.
Completely different from ancient Egypt, where you are expected to sit in front of a panel of 42 judges.
That's interesting.
And confess your sins. Many of which are just absolutely ridiculous because, I mean, everybody sins, right? But the power of the written word, kind of going back a little bit, and I don't want to detract to the next topic that Lauren had mentioned. Part of the power of the written word is that if you write it down, it will make it happen. It'll there is some sort of magical efficacy in writing or inscribing or building a statue or building a tomb or what have you. And with, speaking of the afterlife, we're going to go back and revisit our good friend Osiris again. I can't remember. I think it was poet Normandy Ellis and her book, beautifully written, based loosely on some of the Egyptian books of the dead, which are erroneously named, by the way. They are not called the Books of the Dead. They're called the Books of Coming Forth by Day. Far more optimistic title than Book of the Dead. So I think that's, again, one of the modern negative tropes or morbid tropes that we get. It's like, oh, the Book of the Dead. No, it was actually the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Your soul is going to rise with the sun. Anyway, as far as what I was saying with Normandy Ellis, and I believe it's in her book. If she ends up watching this, I apologize if this is not your reference. But there are two aspects of how the living approach the dead. And that is, of course, based on, this archetype of Osiris. To speak the name, literally, to speak the name of the dead is to make them live again. And so, in so doing, you are remembering them, right? You're remembering their name, their titles, their, role in your life, husband, daughter, wife, whatever. But in Osiris's case, not only is he remembered by his names and by his title as, the Lord of the Underworld, the God of life, the great God, those are titles that he's given. But physically, according to the mythology, he is being remembered, right? His wife brought together all of the members, except for that one part, all of the parts of his body. So you're remembering the dead, but you're also remembering the dead. And since Osiris, in the development very, very early in the dynastic period, you start having evidence of artificial mummification, where the dead are eviscerated and their internal organs are stored, and the body is wrapped and then anointed with various unguents. And we do have much later in Egyptian history, in the New Kingdom and late periods, as you are wrapping the body, you're literally speaking a liturgy for the dead, protective spells. So you're kind of weaving magic, animation magic, into the corpse as you're literally weaving the cloth around the mummified body. And it also has to do with the power of magic in the ancient Egyptian world. Mm-hmm. Again, I still have had way too much coffee. I'm rambling.
Irina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking about several things. First of all, the aspect of being remembered is also something very common in Germanic literature, in all of the Germanic literature. But there's something else I was wondering about. There's also a certain ambiguity in Old Norse literature regarding where you actually are after you die, because doesn't seem to be a lot of difficulty in imagining that people can occupy two places at once. One being in the mound when you're dead, and the other one being, for example, if you died as a warrior in Valhall. So, for example, if you think about the saga of Burnt Njol, you have the hero Gunnar, who dies as a warrior, and you would expect him to be in Valhall, but then again, you find him singing a song near his burial mound. And of course, he uses this song also to convince his kinsmen to avenge him. But he also seems to be very, very pleased with his current situation. So he is one of the tamed revenants, so to speak. And then you have the Helgi poems. Helgi being one of the, let's say, great heroes of Old Norse literature, alongside Sigurd, who was also his brother. So they both were sons of Sigmund. And in the second poem of Helga Kvida Hundingbana, he meets with his wife, who is the Valkyria Sigrun. You can also find her under different names, Valkyria Svova, for example. And here they meet. She doesn't really believe the report of her servant at first when she tells her that she saw her husband riding with his warriors, with the Einherjar of Odin, and they seem to have returned to the mound. But then she goes to the mount, so Sigrun goes to the mount, and then she finds her lifeless husband. And it's not really a terrifying sight, other than the fact that his chainmail seems to be all bloodied, so soaked in blood. And she begins to tend to him. And she also organizes a conjugal visit. So they essentially sleep together, Helgi being dead. And there is no reference to something done besides her will. So this is something that she wanted, and they sleep together. So it was the last night they spent together. But then again, you have this idea that Helgi is both traveling with his companions from Valhall, but at the same time, he is also present, or he can be present, in this burial mound, which, according to the text, seems to function like some sort of portal between the worlds. But then again, at the end of the text, he states that he must ride along the blood-red roads before the rooster, Salgofnir, the rooster of Valhall, sinks. So he actually confesses that he doesn't really belong to the world of the living anymore, but at the same time, sometimes he can come back and live in this mound, so to speak.
Okay, just quick before let me say this first. We have about 10 minutes left. So please, people watching, if you have any questions or comments that you've been thinking of during the stream, please let us know in the chat box and we'll try to get to them before this ends. I also just wanted either Howard or Irina quickly to explain a little bit more about Valhalla, just as we were talking about some stuff that can be seen as connected to, or related to it from Martina. If we can talk about that a little bit, because I think a lot of people have heard that, know that from Marvel movies and whatever. So again, is it a thing of okay, all Norse people are going to Valhalla, or yes?
Over to you.
Okay. So briefly put, as far as I understood it, it is a later concept. So I think, first of all, we had this idea of simply dying and going, generally speaking, to a place called hell, which doesn't have the same religious connotation as the Christian one. It was just the place for everyone to be. And this also has to do with the etymological aspect of a word being related to a word meaning to hide. So I think Valhall is actually a later concept related to this whole idea of the elite warrior and what elite warriors should do in the afterlife. So these are the people Odin uses in Valhall, the so-called Einherjar. He uses them in a very selfish manner in order to try to protect himself from what is to become of him during Ragnarok, because the prophecy foretold him that he was going to be swollen by the wolf Fenrir. Obviously, it doesn't work because I think the most important god in Norse mythology is actually fate, because nobody can escape fate. So it is this concept for elite warriors, and I would insist a little bit on the idea of elite warriors because it is true that I found this rather in later sources, but I think it fits. This idea that not every warrior is actually fit for taking part in this event with Odin or taking part in Valhall, generally speaking, but you also needed a high status. So this is a reference I found, for example, in the saga of Hrolfkraki. Again, it's a later saga, but still, maybe we can surgically remove stuff that would have been possible, at least in older times. And there is this great hero by the name of Bodvar Bjarki, and he keeps on complaining that his companions insist on the fact that every warrior can go to Valhall, and he completely dismisses them. So no, it's a place for elite warriors. But I do suspect, like I said, that the concept is a little later, although that still remains a bit controversial. I mean, there are also really arguments to say that they developed in parallel, the whole idea, the general idea of an afterlife as in hell, and the parallel idea of a special place for these high status people.
Right, again, I like how you said that. That's just kind of what I was getting at, is that there's this you see it multiple times across multiple cultures of having different places in the afterlife, and then according to different stipulations of why you're there, of whatever, because you were a warrior, because you bought your way there, because you whatever it might be, lots of various reasons. Okay, so now that we only have a few minutes left, I guess I want to ask any of you guys if there's any last thoughts that you want to say about this topic. This has been an absolutely great discussion. Thank you so much. This is exactly what we were hoping for. We love talking about the cross-cultural connections, although, not necessarily saying that like these Norse people talk to these Egyptians, but just it's fascinating how similar some things can be with people who weren't necessarily talking about these things to each other. Humans, crazy. So yes, any last thoughts or pieces that you want to give us? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, pretty much all of the context that we know of about the ancient Egyptians, the inscriptions, whether it's on a statue or whether it's written down on papyrus, comes from a very safely guarded elite, right? So maybe at best 5% of the population, given the different time zones, time periods. So what we have is cultural gatekeeping, because all of these mysteries of the dead, these spells, these incantations, they're performed by people who have connections, whether by blood or by promotion to those in power. Now, I find it kind of bittersweet that, the vast majority of the ancient Egyptians, whenever they would bury their dead, we have no idea if did they believe the same thing as the elite? Did they say the same prayers? Because a lot of these bodies, for a poor farmer or a weaver, were sometimes just wrapped in reused bed sheets or wrapped in a reed mat and then put directly into the ground. So, no tomb for, the vast majority of the Egyptian population. And so that, to me, it really kind of brings in, kind of the humanity of an ancient people, of what did they talk about on a day-to-day basis? What did they believe? What did they think about the elites, who were far more wealthy and far more influential and powerful than they themselves were? And I think that power dynamic, that dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, is really, really fascinating. Yeah, I guess that's what I have to say.
Yeah, no, love it. And as always, it shapes. It's like the winners write the book. Like it shapes what we think about these cultures now, for sure, obviously. Yeah, anyone else? Howard?
Did Martine have her hand up before? Or,
That's okay. We'll get to everyone. That's okay.
Okay. I just wanted to say that we haven't had time to delve into the rich archaeological evidence that is revealing just how varied the reactions to the dangerous dead or the deviant dead are. But we've got this is part of the story. It links to Brian's point very much that outside of the elite culture and the literary tropes, there's probably a rich range of different responses. So, for example, the reanalysis of some up to 10 bodies burnt and butchered and found in a pit in the 11th to 13th century medieval village of Warren Percy. One of the interpretations of those is that they are literally hacking up part of their community as a response to a fear of the dead, of a reaction to the undead. Whether we don't know this, we'll never know the circumstances, or whether it was a disease that was spreading and their reaction was to dig up the last 10 people, men, women, and children, and hack up their bodies and burn them and dump them in a pit, or it was a clandestine. There was a sort of a real violent feud going on, and we don't know the details, but when you get the archaeological record, revealing these things, that we don't have a match up to the very sparse written sources. We're just revealing that complexity of responses to, death, dying, and bereavement. And when things go awry or, emergency scenarios have to take place, we're seeing a window onto probably what was a really traumatic moment in a community that just hasn't hit our written sources. And I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else? Not to interrupt someone. Martina, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yes, thank you. Following up on what the gentleman said, for Greek and Roman cultures, it is in a way similar that most written records are, of course, from higher classes. So for us, it's also in a way quite difficult sometimes to reconstruct what lower classes did on a day-to-day basis, how they thought about life and death and such. What we can say, looking at Greek and Roman culture, but also anything up to, say, the 19th, early 20th century, before there was modern medicine and science and such, disease and death were in a way very common daily, a very common part of daily life for everyone. When you look at Rome, 1st century BC, many children, they didn't make it up to the age. They didn't even make it up to the age of 5 or so, and the average age in the time 1st century AD was only 25 years old. So think about how old you are now, and then think about the average life expectation for the Romans in the 1st century AD, basically. And that shows that death, in a way, was part of their everyday life. And when we look at tombstones, so go into archaeological evidence, then we see a bit more also from middle classes and lower classes. We see that those who could afford it, also from lower classes, would make sure that deceased family members had a proper burial, had a tombstone, or even a whole tomb, depending on what they could afford. And they had to maintain the graves, and they had to make sure that within there they had this place for the deceased family members, that they had to make sure they also maintained that place. So that really shows that, in a way, the deceased, especially family members close by, were important for them in day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, you guys, I could keep talking about this forever.
Seriously, I haven't even gotten to the moralizing ghost stories from Egypt.
I know. And now I'm like, okay, what about all, okay, this is not in a mean way of saying this, but there were such high rates of infant mortality in children and stuff. Wouldn't we just be wouldn't there be child ghosts everywhere in everything we're talking about? But all of the stories we were talking about didn't really have to do with children. It's all adults conceptualizing these things. So children aren't even part of it, but there's definitely way more deceased children. than not, you know, so like, where are the children ghosts? So I love that. Okay, we should like do a second version of this panel discussion. This has been great. Thank you guys all so much. I'm honestly like sad to cut it off because this was a great discussion. One little plug at the end. Irina, she did mention she's doing a masterclass tomorrow. This is actually just for our Halloween bash page where you can find information about the masterclass tomorrow if you scan that QR code, or go to saveancientstudies.org/Halloween bash. Irina is doing a masterclass tomorrow at 11 a.m. EST, more in the realm of old Norse sagas, Icelandic sagas. So please do check that out. Irina does do live stream masterclasses with us about once a month too. So as usual, follow us, like and comment on our pages. Thank you guys all so much for joining us. This has been absolutely amazing. We would, of course, love to have you back. We love having these kinds of discussions, talking about all these different awesome ancient cultures. So with that, I think we're going to head out. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Lauren.
you.
Nice
It's
meeting
been
all of you.
great. Looking forward to the next one.